Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here with you. I'm trusting that I'm here with you. My name is Rachel Dry, and I am one of the deputy editors at the politics section of the New York Times. And I'm just thrilled to be talking to you today. I do want to let you know as we get started that the whole session is being recorded, just so you're not surprised by that. And again, we'd love to be hosting you at the Times Center in New York, where we used to do these things, but we're very thrilled and honored that you are pre-gaming for 2 weeks of people talking about politics into computers with us here, just people talking about politics into computer screens. We picked this date for our event before we knew that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would give us some news to talk about, just very lucky. Because nobody knew when Joe Biden was going to make his pick. He definitely didn't. He kept setting his own deadlines and then missing them, which was a very relatable process to me, actually, because I'm someone who's chronically late for appointments I make myself, just texting I'm on my way when I haven't even put on my shoes or vetted half of my outfits. So the whole thing felt very, very familiar to me. We're extremely lucky today because we're able to talk about the news of yesterday and the week with two people who have covered Kamala Harris quite extensively and who know a lot about her and what this choice means for the Biden-Harris campaign. So we are going to talk about swing states also. That's what we originally promised here. But given the news, we're diving in first with Harris. So I want to introduce you to my colleagues, Alex Burns and Astead Herndon, two political reporters here at the New York Times. And we're going to start the conversation talking about Harris. So thanks to both of you. I think you're here with me now. Yes, hi. So obviously we didn't know that we would be talking about this when we set August 12th as a date. So thank you to you for being here and thank you to Joe Biden. So I want to start by talking about Senator Harris herself as a figure and a politician, and then talk about how Biden made this choice and how they're going to work together. And instead, I wanted to start with the day you covered last year over Martin Luther King Day, a holiday in 2019, when Harris entered the Democratic primary race. She did an event at Howard, her alma mater in DC. I wonder if you could talk about what she was pitching voters then and how that compares to what we just saw. I guess she just finished speaking about an hour ago in Wilmington.
Yeah, I think that the Harris campaign, especially particularly early, the successes and the challenges that it had is really instructive to understanding what she could bring to this ticket right now, and kind of the figure that we're now going to see emerge as a leading face in the Democratic Party going forward. When I think about that weekend that she announced, that was wrapped in symbolism. That was not only Martin Luther King Day, but it was also timed to be the week that Shirley Chisholm announced her presidential campaign years prior. She had created a logo that was sought to mimic the Chisholm campaign. And the video tried to invoke themes of moving the Democratic Party forward, not only in a kind of progressive direction, but in the question of representation and having a Black woman step to the forefront of the party after years of them being sidelined. And I remember the questions of those weekend too, kind of what kind of ideological figure would she represent? And that wasn't really answered. She was someone who kind of during the course of that campaign would go back and forth from kind of one foot in the progressive lane to a kind of more pragmatic and moderate approach. And that was something that kind of hounded questions that hounded that campaign throughout. At Howard on that opening weekend, I remember folks asking her about kind of controversial decisions she made as a district attorney, and she was saying, that's in the past, and I'm looking forward. We knew that was not going to be an acceptable answer going throughout the primary, and that stuff somewhat caught up with her. But when we look at this role that she's inhabiting now, the number two, that's something that does not have to really make those big ideological choices that were forced upon her at the top. She'll be the kind of offensive figure for Joe Biden, and that's something she's good at. From the committee hearings to the debate, we know that that's some of the position she's comfortable in, and she's kind of freed of the big picture questions that kind of hounded her throughout the campaign. She's able to lean into the more representational qualities. I think we'll see a Kamala Harris that feels freed from some of the ways that we saw her in the presidential campaign, And I think that that's part of the reason that Vice President Biden selected her.
So you made reference to, during the primary campaign, people hounding her to really get a handle on how she thinks and how she would govern. And I mean, we'll be honest here, among friends, one of those people was. I'm sorry, I muted myself accidentally. Hopefully this doesn't happen next week when people other than me are trying to address the nation about politics. Alex, I wanted to talk about that story you wrote last summer where you examined Harris and how she thinks about governing and what her philosophy is. She gave you that very memorable update to the Cuomo line about, you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. And she said, policy has to be relevant. That's my guiding principle. Is it relevant? Not, is it a beautiful sonnet? Which, as you know, is one of my favorite quotes from the campaign. So tell us, what does Harris think the government is capable of doing?
So I don't know if you can hear me right now. Your audio cut out for me about halfway through the question that you were just asking. And so I am going to sort of take my cues from the fact that you've stopped talking and where you were going, or I think where you were going with the question to sort of give you an answer and then try to fix things on my end if that's where things are. Look, I think Astead alluded to it well, that Senator Harris really struggled during the primary with what she saw as abstract litmus test questions that were not or should not have been relevant to sort of the big picture that she wanted to put out with her campaign. But of course, it's a primary election, and you had 20 some other Democrats who were perfectly, for the most part, delighted to engage in litmus test politics. And Kamala Harris entered the race as certainly a figure of enormous interest across the Democratic Party, but as something of an underdog. And so she didn't have the luxury that Vice President Biden did in a lot of ways of saying, I just want to talk about the big picture of my vision, and I don't really want to get bogged down in the thorny details of whether my single payer healthcare plan would eliminate the private insurance market. That was sort of a fiasco of a question over and over for her in the primary election. So I think Astead really put it well, that it is in some ways the constraints of the running mate role are freeing for her because Joe Biden has set the terms of the campaign ideologically. I do think, going back to the story that you and I, Rachel, worked on a little over a year ago about sort of what Kamala Harris really believes or what her fundamental orientation is, I think rereading it yesterday, it's pretty clear why she and Joe Biden are kind of a political match for each other, that her resistance to, again, what she sees as abstractions, her desire that she obviously did not manage to pull off during the primary to square away this impulse towards inspiration and towards big ideas with a real skepticism that it's responsible to be putting stuff in front of voters that is just not going to pass in a Congress that at best for Democrats probably has 52 or 53 of them. And she never really hit that note with sort of adequate force and clarity during the primary. But talking to people who've worked with her over the years in San Francisco, in Sacramento, and in Washington, there is this sense that she's somebody who is comfortable in the role of sort of an executive who is making judgment calls on a case-by-case basis as policy challenges come before her, but not somebody who is going to, whether it's sort of the Elizabeth Warren approach further to the left or the Cory Booker approach, perhaps a little closer to the center, who is going to have some, expansive integrated tapestry of all her policies and how they are supposed to feed into the moment.
Thank you very much. That was what I asked.
I'm trying to fix my audio now, so just bear with me.
All right. Well, I have a question to Astead. You talked about this in your first answer, but obviously Harris is a barrier-breaking first Black woman on a major party ticket, first Indian American woman on a major party ticket. Our colleague Lisa Lair remembered this joke Harris told on the primary, she was campaigning during the primary, and people would ask her, "Oh, Senator Harris, what is it like to be the first woman, fill in the blank?" And she would say she didn't know anything else, but she was pretty sure a man could do the job just as well. And so I wondered, in your conversations with her, what your sense is of how Harris thinks about her berry-breaking role, and what have you been hearing in the past 24 hours from people about how they're feeling about the moment?
Yeah, I think that this is someone who has broken barriers throughout her life and throughout her political career. And so there is somewhat of a comfort with being that first. She views herself as a trailblazer. She is a trailblazer and kind of thinks of herself as creating a pathway for others. I think that when you think about race, particularly with her, it comes first from a place of empathy. She talks about the way that representation and being in the room can create a space and a vision to see others who may not have been viewed otherwise. And she talks about that as the origin story of how she got into being a prosecutor. I remember her telling a story oftentimes on the trail, somewhat as a reaction to criticism, where she would say when she got through with law school, how folks expected her to go one way or the other. And when she told kind of family and friends that she wanted to be a prosecutor, the real shock that they felt. But her explanation was always that she viewed that getting into that system was the way to change that. And that if she brought in her unique lens, not only because of race, but geographically, she's lived kind of across the world, that this is someone who could treat others in a way that other prosecutors wouldn't. And she sees that as a kind of foremost way in which she's enacted change. You know, I remember when she wrote out her criminal justice plan and asking her about the criticisms, that no matter how much empathy one has, that she was still taking part in the system that people are currently viewing as opposed to marginalized groups. And she was saying that we should want people of color in every position, and that could be something that created better outcomes. But she also admitted that this was that she was acting within the kind of political constraints of the moment. And I remember she used the phrase, you know, she's changed with the winds that have come since then. And I think that that is a kind of insight into how she views her political philosophy, somewhere in the middle, the center left of where Democratic Party politics is. And I think that what we're seeing in this moment, this kind of reckoning around race that we're seeing across the country, folks are coming along to that kind of empathetic first view. When the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were kind of talking about systemic change and systemic racism and proposing policies that Senator Harris wouldn't endorse, her supporters would say, where were they 20 years ago? Where were they 30 years ago when she cared about these issues and got involved in it on that front? That's not going to be acceptable to the kind of progressive wing of the party, but in a mainstream Democratic pitch, in a general election pitch, and what might be a future presidential run pitch, you can see that working for her.
So this is, you answered probably what my next question is going to be before I asked it, but I'm still going to ask it to both of you. But first I'm going to remind the people joining us that you can also get a question in if you'd like, and we'll turn to your questions very shortly. It's questions@nytimes.com. So what I wanted to ask, I mean, I know you've been free of the most annoying question political reporters get for 24 hours, which is who's Joe Biden going to pick as his running mate? So now I'm going to ask you a related annoying question, which is why was it Harris? Astead, you gave us a sense of what her general election pitch might be. How did that play into why she was the pick?
Well, I think that she checked, and I don't mean this in a racial or ethnic sense, but I think that there was a lot of political views that also she checked the box for. That when you look at the scope of other people that Joe Biden could have selected, they all had kind of liabilities that he would have to care so deeply about them, either personally or politically, that he decided to overcome. Harris is always the one who kind of fit the most criteria. She's someone who has kind of unquestioned legislative executive experience. She has won statewide. He would not be pulling someone who had not been vetted on the national stage. And I think that kind of known quantity worked really well for her here. And especially because the alternatives were kind of flavor of the moment, people who came up and came down. You would see someone who fulfilled maybe had a personal relationship with Joe Biden like a Susan Rice, or maybe satisfied a progressive wing like a Karen Bass, but then they did not have the kind of tried and true tested qualities that she did. And I think that we should also remember that her campaign was one that not only tried to appeal to people of color, but they would always say that they had a real inroads to that kind of suburban white woman who might be leaving President Trump. I think that Harris is a running mate choice that they think can play in multiple lanes, and that no one had quite the breadth that she did.
So, Alex, I'm sorry. So you're hinting at this, and I wanted to get Alex in on this because we were originally going to talk about the map and swing states today. And so I'm wondering, what voters in particular do you think the Biden campaign is signaling it's hoping to reach? Who are the people that Harris as a pick is assigned to?
Well, I think it's sort of, I hope this doesn't sound like a cop-out, but I think the hope is that it's basically everybody. And that's sort of the fundamental political theory of the Biden candidacy, is that you can talk to everybody, that you don't need to sort of chop the country into tiny little slivers of demographic or economic characteristics and then laser target your message the way I think a whole lot of people spent 2016 thinking that you could and should do. I don't think it's a risk-free approach to for the Biden campaign or for Senator Harris. I think the theory here is that she doesn't alienate anybody who's already for Joe Biden. So the sort of white suburban women who Astead was just alluding to, every indication during the Democratic primary was that professional white women are just fine with Kamala Harris and see something of themselves in her, despite the obvious differences in their personal identities. I think, obviously, Black voters are the cornerstone of Joe Biden's political coalition. And I think the hope is that, while there was never any question that Joe Biden was going to win Black voters by an overwhelming margin, the hope is that there will be people who are maybe Black voters under 50, who maybe are a little bit more liberal, who will be more enthusiastic about voting for Joe Biden and more likely to actually go through the arduous process in a pandemic of getting an absentee ballot, voting by mail, waiting in line on election day in states across the Midwest and especially in the Mid-Atlantic and the South, where if Joe Biden were to get even modestly higher turnout from Black communities, it could be absolutely decisive up and down the map. And then I think the hope is that young people will look at Senator Harris and see somebody who looks like the future, or certainly looks more like the future that they imagine and the America that they experience than Joe Biden does. So again, never really a question that Biden was going to carry young people over President Trump. But there are plenty of young voters who see Joe Biden as a figure of the past, and that's a big liability in any presidential election. I think Senator Harris is a tough person to characterize as kind of a backward-looking pick.
That was so diplomatically put, that not everyone sees the future when they look at Joe Biden.
Every time we do one of these, I say something euphemistic and you call me on it.
It's a compliment. It was artfully done. And when you were talking about the arduous process of voting by absentee ballot in a pandemic, I also thought of the arduous process of watching the conventions. Hopefully everyone gets their Zoom situation better together than I have now. So last one to both of you from me, and then I'm going to get to some of these great questions we got from people who are watching. And you both covered them both. What do we know about how they work together and how they feel about each other? Sorry, Astead, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think that, what we all know was that their initial primary clash was probably the most fierce kind of interpersonal moment of the primary. And that was real. I remember covering Harris at that time, and what you would hear from both of those camps was a real sense of betrayal from some of the Biden folks who felt as if she had kind of unfairly come at the vice president in hopes of taking some of those voters and kind of moving up on the primary ladder. I think what we know now is a couple things. The way that the process ended for her, I think at the timing in which she dropped out, created a real sense of goodwill for people that even did not think so highly of her campaign, that thought that the process did wrong by Senator Harris. And I think that kind of kicked off what was the road into these camps being kind of healing the wounds. And we also know that there is some personal connection between them. They mentioned the relationship that she had with Beau Biden, the vice president's late son. They mentioned the kind of interactions they would sometimes have at the campaign trail. But by the time she dropped out the race, you had that image of Joe Biden feeling really shocked and kind of emotional at that sight, at hearing that word, even though she was still at that time his rival. I think that that kind of that time turned the kind of public Democratic Party opinion with Harris, and I also think we have entered a new moment with the kind of with especially with the protests that are happening across the country, the cries out from Democratic operatives and activists that he should be choosing a woman of color. When that pressure was applied to the vice president, and you look out at the landscape of his options, who were the people who he had the personal relationships with, that he had kind of the known quantity of. And I think that led roads back to her. I remember even back at that, during that first debate moment, it was never about what Joe Biden felt.
Sorry, I think that most of our people who are joining us know exactly what you're talking about, but just in case not everyone has an encyclopedic memory of the first of two June Democratic primary debates in 2019.
Yeah.
Second to you.
Yes, Senator Harris had her moment where she came at the vice president around busings, particularly saying that he kind of stood in the way of racial progress. And she told her personal story about how she was one of the children who grew up in an integrated school on a busing program, and the famous "that little girl was me" line, and talking about how he worked with segregationists to kind of block that progress. During that time in the aftermath, you would hear Biden supporters upset, you would hear his advisors upset, but it would always come back to that he thought this was a part of politics, that he was stung, that he was off guard, but he was not holding a long-term grudge. I think that we've seen that play out.
Great. I am going to cut you off there because I'm conscious that I've been asking other questions. And Alex, if you have a great Biden-Harris story, please tell it. But I'm also going to present this related question to you from Milt, who's nodding to the fact you diplomatically put to that Joe Biden is not a young man. So he's asking, it seems many believe the odds are high that Joe Biden will either opt to be a one-term president or may become incapacitated during his first term, leading to President Harris, or that Senator Harris is certain to run for president. What, if any, extra expectations do such scenarios put upon a President Biden and a VP Harris?
Well, I think it's something that you hear from Biden advisors and from other folks across the party who have done pretty rich opinion research on this and found that voters, more so than in a typical election year, are viewing Biden's running mate as a backup president, as somebody who really might get a phone call in the middle of the night and be told, like, you're in charge now. I do think that really raised the bar for the qualifications of the person that he's choosing, that at the end of the day, the odds that he was going to choose somebody who was a relatively junior member of the House or in their first term as mayor of a major city, however appealing they might be for other reasons, I think that was really hard to imagine. Look, I think one of the big dynamics to watch over certainly the next few months and the next 4 years and 3 months, if they win, is going to be, how patient is Kamala Harris, and more importantly, the world around Kamala Harris, as Joe Biden wants to sort of take every day that he has as president, and perhaps he'll want, another 4 years of those days at the end of it. I think there is a general assumption in Democratic politics that he would be a one-term president, but I also think that you can imagine a world where a couple of years from now we're having a conversation and he's seen as having done a good job on COVID and the economy is back, and boy, it's really hard to tell a president who's popular that it's time for you to go. So I think he wouldn't have chosen Senator Harris if he didn't have a high degree of confidence that they were going to be able to make that personal relationship work. But even the legendary Obama-Biden relationship was not as smooth and uncomplicated as people now say that it was.
It looks on the T-shirts that they're selling. Yeah,
right.
It looks great on the T-shirt now. So I'm going to do a rapid round here of a few more listener questions from a listener named Alero. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She writes, as an ambitious Black woman, I was told early in my career that the higher I climb, the more I will experience limitations because certain people will be threatened by my strength and voice. And this is the question, is there a risk that middle-class college-educated white women will not vote for Harris because she's an ambitious Black woman? Could this cost Democrats? I guess you did mention, it seemed like those voters during the primary were responding positively here, but what do you see? Is there any risk there?
Look, I think there's, Well, I think there's always a risk when you're asking voters to do something that they've never done before, and that asks them to broaden their cultural experience of who they are putting in positions of leadership. And I think that's something that the Biden campaign was sensitive to in this process. It's something that the Clinton campaign 4 years ago was sensitive to, deciding that they wanted a white guy as a running mate because you could only ask the country to embrace so much change at once. But I do think the last couple months have really reshaped the dynamics of the way moderate, educated voters are thinking about and prioritizing issues of race. That I think that if you were imagining a scenario where the killing of George Floyd and the protests after it hadn't happened, and where the Republican president or the Republican nominee was somebody who was somewhat less abhorrent to educated moderate whites, then yeah, I think that's absolutely a dynamic that Democrats would have been very concerned about in this election. As things stand right now, I don't think we've seen anything in the first 24 hours of this choice, either what we're hearing from voters, what we're hearing from political leaders around the country, or what we're hearing from President Trump, that suggests that there's some clever strategy that Republicans have to try to drive a wedge between Joe Biden and those voters based on his choice of a running mate.
Astead, is there anything you wanted to add on that particular subject? And I'm going to kick one last one to you here.
Yeah, I think largely retweet whatever all Alex has said. I would say that
this is talking. This isn't Twitter. Just I know it's like a porous thing, but anyway.
Astead is platform neutral.
I would say that in this moment, just to emphasize the last point, choosing someone who was not a person of color was also seen as a risk. And that because of the way that the campaign has kind of let this play out in public, there was so much pressure, there was so much expectation around the kind of racial makeup of the ticket that you saw a Democratic Party that really, I think for the first time, that all white ticket was seen as just as risky or even more risky than embracing some vision of the Democratic Party that stepped into a different type of racial makeup. And I don't know if that stays the same if Joe Biden, doesn't say that it's going to be a woman very early. I don't know if that stays the same if the protest doesn't happen. But I know as this process played out, that pressure became greater and greater.
And let me just jump in there, Rachel, just for 3 seconds, and just to plug a different New York Times project. Our own polling showed that educated white voters were as likely in many parts of the country to want a Black running mate as Black voters were. So there can be a difference between what people tell a pollster and what they truly believe in their hearts. But every evidence we have so far is that it would have been risky, even with white voters, to put forward an all-white ticket.
That is covered that ground very well. And I like ending on a plug for our colleagues journalism, additional journalism on all platforms. We are going to jump off here with Alex and Astead and switch gears to the swing state portion of the evening. And I just want to thank you both very much and encourage everyone listening to follow them on all their platforms, many platforms, which you can read and hear their analysis. Thank you both. We'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So now it's my great pleasure to switch gears here. When we got news yesterday, we wanted to keep bringing you what we had planned. And we have the 2 wonderful reporters to talk to us about swing states and Florida in particular. And we're joined now by Nick Corasaniti and Pati Mazzei. Nick is a political reporter and Pati is the Miami bureau chief. And it's hard to know what's happening in swing states, but one way to tell, of course, is how campaigns are spending their money and what kind of ads they're running. And Nick tracks ads as part of his job. So I wanted us to start by looking at some of what people in swing states are viewing. I realize right now, as I'm saying this, so that presumes most of you are not currently in a swing state, and I will confess that I'm not. And so I apologize if we're going to show you what you're already seeing, but it's going to help us talk about how the battleground looks. So Nick, I think we're going to get started just with some clips quickly. Can you set up the first one for us?
Sure. The first two ads we'll see one from the Trump campaign and one from the Biden campaign. And these are the two ads that are in the heaviest rotation right now. That means that they're airing at the most rapid clip in battleground states around the country. So these are the two ads that, in theory, the Biden and Trump campaign think are their most important messages right now.
Great. Okay, let's take a look.
American products and support American jobs. It's time to help small businesses. We'll purchase clean energy technologies to fight climate change and enhance national security. We have to invest in what the jobs and industries of tomorrow are going to be. We have a great opportunity to build back and build back better.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Nick, for putting that together. So tell us where that message is airing and what each campaign is trying to do with that. It seems like it's pretty clearly a jobs message, it's an economic future message. Is it tailored for states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania that were the blue wall states that Trump won in 2016?
Yeah, the Biden campaign, the ad at the end was economic message focused on, the title of the ad is Made in America. It's all about the economic revival after the coronavirus pandemic. Their campaign is advertising, I believe, in 8 states, which includes the blue wall states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And it's clearly a message that's tailored to go right for those states, right the kind of industrial vote that seemingly swung towards President Trump in 2016, that so many people assumed Vice President Biden would be the best person to possibly win them back, coming from Scranton, coming from Pennsylvania, and being able to, throughout history, speak to kind of the industrial voter. It's also unique for the Biden campaign. They're the only ones up in Michigan right now. The Trump campaign has completely abandoned the airwaves in Michigan, which is a state that he won by just over 10,000 votes in 2016. So it's notable that they don't either feel they have a chance there at the moment and aren't spending money, or are overly confident, even though the polls currently show Vice President Biden with a double-digit lead there.
And that's in Michigan. Thanks, thank you on that. And I know you pulled a couple other ads too, is that right? Featuring older Americans?
Yeah, so, well, real quick, the first ad that you saw there with the woman holding the card, that was the Trump campaign's most recent ad after they reset their entire ad campaign. They went dark for a week, which is very unusual for this point of a campaign. And that ad that you saw was kind of Trump returning to his original core messages, talking a lot about illegal immigration in some pretty fearful tones, talking a lot about socialist takeover of the Democratic Party and painting Joe Biden, pretty moderate Democrat, as a socialist candidate. So that's kind of how his advertising has switched. Now, what he did almost for the past month has been advertise exclusively on defunding the police. And his one of his most expensive ads that he spent the most money on was an ad about an older woman whose home was broken into. And both Biden and Trump have been fighting pretty hard over the senior vote. And these next two ads are clearly aimed at the senior vote.
Great, let's take a look.
Like, our elderly have not been a priority for this administration, that they don't matter. And I feel like my grandmother didn't matter. Last time I saw my grandmother, we weren't going to be allowed in the hospital. We asked if we could video chat her, and everyone could say a little something. We gathered as a family, we prayed.
Absolutely on board with defunding the police. Listen closely.
Yes, absolutely.
Hello, you've reached 911. I'm sorry that there is no one here to answer your emergency call, but leave a message and we'll get back to you as soon as we can.
Crime will rise significantly.
Great, thank you. Hi again. Are you back? Patty, did it feel like you were watching television in Florida?
Yes, and we get all of those ads all of the time, and we also get them in Spanish. not just here, but I also watch Puerto Rican television, and they air in Spanish and Puerto Rican television, not to try to persuade Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, but to persuade Puerto Ricans in Florida. And so it's funny seeing them in English when I'm used to seeing the same ones in Spanish. It's, you know, they just have bilingual speakers in order to be able to do that.
And let's talk about older voters. Patty, what's your sense of how important the campaigns view those voters in Florida, and what's the fight like for them there?
I think they're going after them very hard, and the Democrats think because the coronavirus has affected so many elderly people that if they message that Trump has failed in some way in handling the virus, that they have a chance at winning over more older voters that they would have otherwise. I, sense that the message coming from the Trump campaign in general is that Democrats are the people you vote for if you want chaos, if you want disarray, if you want radicalism. And they're trying to sort of return to the message of 2016, as Nick was saying, which was, law and order in the economy, and not talk about the coronavirus. And in Florida, we have just had an incredible number of cases, an incredible number of deaths, including of elderly people, although also of younger people, as my colleagues have reported. And I don't know how that's going to play out in the end. I think those people are going to be fought over more than they would have been if we had not been in the pandemic.
So on that theme, one more question from me, and then we'll throw it to some great listener questions too. But Patty, you wrote a story back in the middle of March, which was a whole pandemic ago. It's right when it was just starting, about how Democrats were viewing Florida. You quoted a voter registration activist there who said, if you can win in Florida, you can win anywhere. So I'm wondering, how people are feeling about Florida. What's your sense of how much the pandemic and the economy have changed that feeling from mid-March where the Democrats were pretty optimistic?
The economy here is going to be a real problem because of the pandemic. It's a service economy. We had, 10% unemployment in June, and that was a drop from like 14% in March. The amount of people who are unemployed in the state of Florida is more than 2 million. And I don't know if hearing a message from the president about the economy rebounding at a macro level, if that is what is happening, is going to sink in if you have voters who don't have a job or can't get unemployment checks, or know people who don't have a job and can't get unemployment checks. We have huge lines for food distribution. So I think we don't know the entire effect of that. To your point about Democrats here being optimistic, they have not been able to register as many voters as they would have liked, but they have seen a huge growth in their vote by mail operation, which is how Republicans have always managed to get elected in Florida, despite the tiny margins that separate the elections here. And that is something that Democratic operatives are feeling pretty good about, especially Miami, where I'm right now, is having a local primary election, and they are seeing numbers that they've never seen before.
Thanks. Please.
If there's any thought of like how important at least the Trump campaign is thinking about Florida, they've already spent over $20 million on television ads there. That's by far the most they've spent anywhere in the country, and they have about 40 million in reserve there, which is about double what they have in any other state. So if advertising is the ultimate tell, if we were playing a game of poker, they're clearly telling you that they're all in on Florida.
Okay, I don't have a poker analogy to keep going with this line of questioning, but so that's the Florida spending picture. What do the rest of sort of the ad budgets tell us about what the campaigns, which states the campaigns think are most important to them? So the Trump campaign, Florida, what does Biden spending tell us?
Well, Biden just announced that he was going to embark on the most expensive television ad campaign, fall campaign in history, with over $200 million on television, not as much on digital, but we haven't necessarily seen those buys start to shake out as much, so we don't have complete intel into how they're going to weight that. What we have seen that is them spending pretty heavily in Pennsylvania and also Florida. Those are the two states that the Biden campaign has spent pretty much by far the most money in, and a close third is North Carolina, which has multiple TV markets. One state that's becoming a very interesting battleground is Arizona. It's been a red state for a while, yet it's one of the few states that both campaigns are up in. The Trump campaign's only up in 5 states right now after resetting their ad buy. So seeing this kind of competition in Arizona and multiple millions spent by both campaigns at this moment shows that that really is going to be a battleground state come November.
Thank you for that. Patty, a quick take on this one, and then turning it over to these great audience questions. But I did want to ask, because you've covered Florida and Florida politics for a while, which means you've covered Latino voters and having to explain to people that there's no such thing as a monolithic Latino vote. Just quickly, I wondered what your sense is of how each campaign is tailoring a message to Latino voters, especially where you are in Florida and Arizona, which Nick just mentioned.
Well, I think the Biden choice of Harris was an acknowledgement that if they had picked, for example, Representative Karen Bass of California, who was in consideration until the very end, it would have been a problem for them with Latinos here because of her views, which were frankly offensive to a lot of Miami voters, who a lot of them are Republican, but a lot of them are not. And it wasn't just Cubans, it was also other South Americans. I have noted, and Nick and I have talked about this, how both campaigns this year have been releasing ads in different accents in Spanish, whether they're, actual voice actors from those countries or just doing the accents is something I don't know, but Puerto Rican accents, Cuban accents, Mexican accents. This is not something that we had seen so much of in past campaigns. And I think it's an acknowledgement that people like to hear themselves on TV. And I just found it fascinating that both campaigns early on decided to do that.
It's the exact same script, just a different.
No, it's not actually always the same script. Sometimes they even use sort of different colloquialisms and different issues that voters from different ethnic backgrounds care about. So it's much more tailored to the fact that you don't appeal to all Hispanics with the same message.
In Florida, we see a lot more ads from the Trump campaign talking about socialism, which is clearly aimed right at some of the Cuban American voters in Miami.
And Governor Ron DeSantis won in 2018 in part with that message as a Republican.
I'm not going to ask what accent the socialism ads are in, like a Joseph McCarthy timbre. So I want to get to these questions here, and the important one for both of you from Tom in Colorado, who's asking how important is turnout in swing states and among these voters. Patty, let's start with what you're hearing about Florida turnout.
Well, we did some reporting on the Jacksonville area when we thought that the RNC might be held there. And what's always interesting about North Florida is that it votes Republican, but Duval County, where Jacksonville is, voted Democratic for governor in 2018, right? So, suggesting that it's moving more like other cities and urban areas. And even though the suburbs of Jacksonville are deeply red, like the city core was maybe not so much anymore. That doesn't mean that Trump is going to lose Duval County. What it means is that if Democrats try to campaign there, and Hillary Clinton did not campaign in Jacksonville in 2016, they could close the margins. And in Florida, it's all the margins. It's, this is 100,000 votes here or there wins an election. And you don't do that by just campaigning the same way everywhere. You sort of build these little pockets of votes in different parts of the state. And so that turnout factor, it's real. It's not just getting voters out on election day. It's trying to appeal to them in parts of the state where you're not going to win, but you just don't want to lose by such a big margin. And the Trump campaign will be doing the same thing in Miami and Fort Lauderdale, trying to not just let it be a Democratic wipeout.
Nick, I want to add one question to this general point of turnout and talk about Wisconsin. Alexis asks about the importance of the suburbs of Milwaukee in the upcoming election. So I wondered what we know about what kind of money people are spending in Wisconsin and Milwaukee in particular, and what the turnout picture there might be.
Yeah, when you look at the ad spending in Wisconsin in general, the biggest percentage, almost the majority, is almost always spent in Milwaukee by both campaigns. Now, Milwaukee is obviously the Democratic heartbeat of Wisconsin, but those three counties, the WOW counties as they're known, I'm not going to try and pronounce them because I'll butcher it, but are Republican strongholds, and where Scott Walker found a lot of his power a couple years ago. So what we've seen though, kind of in 2018 and then in the April elections, is that those counties which used to be so predominantly Republican are actually starting to swing a little bit blue. They're certainly not blue counties, but the turnout there, as Patty was talking about the pockets, there is a little bit of that quote unquote suburban revolt that we've seen in other states happening in those suburbs. Some voters just don't find themselves comfortable with the direction that Trump has started to take the Republican Party and are starting to peel away. And in those counties too, if you're talking about turnout, the big part in Wisconsin is going to be, a pretty big vote by mail effort. It's a state that has no excuse absentee vote by mail. And the Democrats in particular there have really turned on their get out the vote operation to an absentee ballot operation. And that really helped them in the April election. And that's how they were able, in part, to win that state Supreme Court seat in April.
So I want to close this section with a question to both of you that's from several people, both Paul and Joshua here in this I'm looking at, but it's basically about, is anyone really undecided? In this moment, we've talked a lot about the effect of the Harris pick, and we'll be talking a lot about debates and ads. But in this year's election, do you think there are many voters who are truly still undecided and can be swayed? So Patty, I wonder what you're hearing when you talk to people in Florida and what you think about that, whether people are really on the fence.
I mean, I think every election we've sort of seen fewer and fewer true swing undecided voters. Right now, I wonder how many people are paying attention to politics as much as they would normally in August of an election year, because there is so much else to worry about in the world. There is so much else going on. Are people following this, as closely as they would be if candidates were out campaigning in person, if these events were actually happening? I don't think so. I don't get the same sort of vibe of people being that invested yet in the presidential campaign. So how many of them are swing voters? I don't know, but how many are thinking right now about going out to vote is a question that I would ask myself if I were a campaign right now. Even the people who are decided, how are they going to vote? Are they going to go vote because they have all these other things on preoccupying their minds right now?
I don't know what you're implying about how compelling or not compelling video chats are, because that's all we have in terms of talking about politics. Thanks on that. So maybe not that people are undecided, but they haven't bothered to think about it at all yet. Nick, what do you think?
Well, I mean, that's probably why you hear when you talk to a lot of campaign field operatives, they start their phone conversations checking in with how voters are doing. So there's certainly the coronavirus in the top of everyone's mind. It seems like the bases have become more dug in. There's certainly larger bases because Donald Trump has been just so polarizing and kind of built his whole brand of politics around being divisive. But there is certainly still voters out there who are making up their mind, who might be happy with how the economy was before the pandemic, but not so happy with how the handling of the coronavirus has gone. I'm working on a story right now with my colleague Reed Epstein about college football. And it's funny to see the people who blame either side for not having college football. And, people who are ground in the base are going to blame either the Democrats or are going to blame President Trump for the loss of the Big Ten. Yet others who are just walking around just kind of feel like their entire life has been upended. They don't know who to blame because they don't know where to turn. And I think that might actually end up being a swing voter, someone who's just had their lives completely torn apart, and they're going to look at this with fresh eyes.
I don't know if that would be an optimistic thing for campaign operatives to know. People are so desperate that they're willing to give you a listen, but that's a really interesting point, and interesting point about football as well. So we're nearing the end here, and I want to finish off with one last question that will maybe transition our East Coast viewers into dinner hour. You both talked about, how the campaign is grounded. The pandemic has changed everything, which means there's there are no campaign stops at diners or Philly cheesesteak places or all the standard, the best Cuban restaurant shop. I mean, all the standard local food photo ops. And Nick, I know this is a particular area of interest of yours. So I wondered to each of you, what is the best food that candidates or campaign reporters are missing? And I guess, how might one go about recreating at home if possible? So what to you is like the iconic campaign stop food that we're just not getting this time?
Well, I mean, from my point of view, and I'd love to hear Patty's thoughts, it's the Cuban food in Miami. I mean, I looked forward to traveling to Miami with President Trump because I was really trying to find the best Cuban sandwich and the best shrimp with red garlic sauce. And I think I found it. I hope it's still open. La Sanguich of Miami had a really kind of new wave take on it. It was a little bit fresher roast pork, shaved, really good. That's probably my favorite food that you really can't get close to anywhere else in the country. So that would be my top pick. And I don't know if I picked one of the better places, Patty.
Well,
Patty,
I
what
think
do
you
you think?
did. We had a couple of Cuban meals in 2016 in Miami, if I remember correctly. I do like to bring them when you guys are in town to show you around. For me, I like the excuse of leaving Miami to go cover campaigns, and very rarely do presidential campaigns going to the Florida Keys. But anytime like a congressional candidate or someone will campaign in the Keys, I will like raise my hand and volunteer to go, because the drive is beautiful and you can get just such fresh fish and seafood. And there's a place that does a lobster Reuben in Marathon that is delicious. I know it sounds strange, but the lobster Reuben is just a fun meal to have. They sort of use their leftover lobster for that. So,
Well, for many reasons, including a lobster Reuben, which you made sound delightful, it would be great to exist in a world where people could get back out on the road. But for now, we will take your word for it. And we're going to sign off there. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, bearing with us as we switched gears a bit to get you 2 news topics in one a little slightly more than 45-minute as advertised session. So thanks to my guests, Alex Burns, Nick Corasaniti, Pati Mazzei, and Astead Herndon, all New York Times reporters who were here with us. There are more events. We hope you'll join next Tuesday, August 18th, on the anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, where we'll be showcasing a new virtual play called Finish the Fight, celebrating the unsung heroes of suffrage. And we will see you again, we hope. It's a little presumptuous of me. I hope to see you again at our next Election 2020 conversation in September. We'll be talking about young voters, about Gen Z, the issues they care about, what will drive them to show up and vote. And I will try very hard not to make anyone explain TikTok to me. So to RSVP to any of those events, go to timesevents.nytimes.com. And one final note, it's a real privilege to be here with you, and all of our work is made possible by our subscribers. So thank you for your support and have a wonderful night. Good night.